Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to talk about landscape photography. Now this is a subject which you could write a book on alone. There's so many different ways to approach landscape photography. This is the fundamentals. These are guidelines that can help you get started. We'll get into more technical stuff at a later stage, but for now, these are the basics of photographing landscapes. The first thing we've got to talk about is getting the feel of it. Landscape photography is actually more difficult than people take it to be. They think because your subject is still, nothing's moving, you've got time to use, you can accomplish great landscape photography with ease. It's actually the complete opposite. It's a very difficult thing to get right. You've got to take your time with landscape photography. When you get into a scene, you've got to ask yourself, what am I trying to say? What am I here for? What is essential in this scene? What do I want in the frame? What don't I want in the frame? What's not important? And find a good position to get rid of non-essential elements. I always talk about simplification. It is very powerful in landscape photography. What's so important with landscape photography is to research and plan your image. Sometimes you come across a great image in a landscape and you're ready and everything goes right. If you really want to be consistent in creating great landscape images, a bit of researching and planning goes a long way. It might be as simple as walking a beachfront the day before and just looking what's available and planning your shot from there. In today's day, it's made much easier with various apps. You can use star photography apps that show you the constellations of the night sky, where exactly the Milky Way is, and you can plan your shot to align the Milky Way with a certain subject. And there's a number of different apps and programs that can even give you a good idea of a landscape and where you want to position yourself long before you even arrive in the area. It could be on the other side of the world. You can just look on Google Earth and get a good idea of what the landscape looks like. Or PhotoPills is a great app of seeing where the Milky Way is, or seeing the layout of the land and how to plan yourself for a rising or setting sun, or where the Milky Way might lie. And one of the most underrated techniques of getting a landscape shot right is when you're strolling the beach or the desert or the jungle or the forest or the mountains, wherever you might be, is to use your hands as a frame and picture the frame before you take it. Sometimes it takes a bit of a while to set up our gear, and if we get the shot wrong, it can get frustrating. So literally just hold your hands up in a frame, however you want to do it, like this, like however, just create a frame, and now you can move it around your landscape and see what might look good and might not look good. You without your gear can move around very quickly, so you can access many different frames at once, and simply by moving your hands you can allow in more elements or reduce the elements or take away elements, non-essential elements. And it's a very useful technique of picturing the picture, of understanding why you're there and what needs to be said. Another thing to consider with landscape photography, now this is not a rule, but it does help guide you to better images, is having a style and perfecting it. Now, some photographers don't have a style. They choose a particular style according to each scene. One style might suit one scene better, another style another. But the difference with them is they've become masters at all these different styles. If you're average at each style, and a style might be warm and rich colors and heavily saturated colors, it might be dark and gloomy, it might be snowscapes, it might be beachscapes, it might be many different things. This is what we mean by styles. And like I said, you can get good at all of them. And with many scenes, a particular style does suit it a little bit better. The best image in that scene lies with a particular style. But what I mean is, if you've got access to beachfront every day and setting suns and rocks and beautiful colors, master using beautiful colors to your advantage. If you have access to forests and you're in an environment where it's often dark and grey and gloomy, master the gloomy style. Master what you have access to and then master the next style. Because when you start applying styles and applying them well and consistently, that's when your landscape work is really going to come to life. And we're going to go into each one of these styles individually at a later stage and show you how to perfect each one of them. With composition and landscape photography, it is so important. Composition is everything. I say composition is everything with every photograph. I think that's the beginning and the end of a photograph. The most important thing is your composition. And with landscape photography, it couldn't be more true. Aligning your elements within the frame is so important. Are you going to use the rule of thirds? Are there two elements that are important? Make sure they line up. You can move around now to a certain extent, sometimes to a great extent. You can move around, so make sure those subjects line up. If you have a central subject and you have similar patterns on either side of it, use a nice strong central composition. If you have leading lines, use those leading lines. With landscape photography, composition is so important. It's the thing you got to think about long before you think of your camera settings. you've got to compose your elements correctly. Now we're going to talk about simplifying and protecting your edges. Again, I usually apply this to all my photography. Simplification is so important. Deciding what you need in your frame and what you don't need in your frame, and eliminating non-essential elements. If those non-essential elements are anywhere in your frame, they fight for attention. And in landscape photography, sometimes there's not a lot of attention to give, so you must do your best to eliminate what's not important. And on top of that, protect your edges. In landscape photography, if anything bright or anything highly contrasting is along those edges, it's going to destroy the image. So protect your edges and get rid of what you don't need in the frame. It might be as simple as moving forward, zooming in, moving back, moving to the left. It's usually a very simple fix, so do it. Now we're going to talk about what I believe is as important as composition, could even be more important than composition when it comes to landscape photography, and that is to anchor your image. When we're shooting a live subject, that anchor is easy. Our subject, our live subject, our leopard, our lion, our human is our anchor. It's very easy to know what the anchor is. In landscape photography, it's a little bit more difficult. And what I mean by an anchor is what your viewer's eyes will land on, the main subject. There might be more than one, but your viewer needs to find it. That anchors the image. When the viewer looks through the image or looks at the image, they're anchored by that particular object. Now, it could be anything. It could be a setting sun that's the anchor. It could be a tree on the horizon. It could be the roof of a house or the entire house. It could be a rock, but it anchors the image. The viewer settles on that element. You can take a beautiful image of a coastline and some beautiful colors, or forest and mountain, or a snowscape. If there's no anchor, it's just a picture with some colors in it. It doesn't have strength. The viewer doesn't know what to look at. And quite often with an image like this, the viewer will take one glance at it if you're lucky and move on. There's nothing of interest there. The viewer doesn't know where to look. So anchoring the image is so important. Quite often, if you take a landscape shot and you're looking at it and you go, this is pretty bland, something's wrong here, I don't like this. The first question you need to ask is, what is my anchor? And if you can't answer that question, it means you haven't looked for one, and you need to change your composition and look for an anchor and compose it carefully, and you'll often find your image will be improved. We're also going to look at leading lines. Now we'll go into depth on leading lines in landscape photography, but what they do essentially is help the viewer travel through the image. And this is something I always speak highly of. If you can get the viewer to travel through an image, to be drawn into it, and leading lines really help with that. They're used most effectively when those leading lines will eventually lead you to the anchor and your eyes settle on the most important subject of your image. Some images might not have a very strong anchor, and the leading line is what the photographer counts on to lead the viewer to the right place. So using leading lines in landscape photography is all too important when you're creating a journey and you want your viewer to travel through the frame. You want the viewer to stay with the image and look through it instead of passing on so quickly. Now we must talk about picture planes. We've spoken about picture planes before. In landscape photography, it's so important because the landscape, which with wildlife photography would be your foreground and background, is now your subject. So we've really got to consider picture planes more than we ever have and what they mean. So what they essentially do is divide up the frame, but they can also give emphasis to what's important in the frame. And in landscape photography, we use them to distinguish certain elements of our image and what we want to be important, what we're trying to say. Remember, I'm always talking about what are we trying to say with our image. So if your sky is important, and remember your sky and your ground are going to be two different picture planes. And if you want to emphasize the vastness of the sky, maybe it's best to have 2/3 of your picture planes as sky and 1/3 as ground, or maybe even less ground and even more sky. You're emphasizing the sky. And it's slightly different if what's important is on the ground, if it's the flowers, if it's the grasslands, if it's the rocks or the leaves and the textures. What's on the ground is important, then maybe having 2/3 of ground and 1/3 of sky is the route you need to go because you're emphasizing what's on the ground. That's what matters a little bit more. It might be half and half. It might be half sky and half ground. Both are important. There's details on the ground that are important. There's details in the sky that are important. You're trying to talk about both in your image. That's what you're trying to say. Then you do a half and half shot. But this is what using picture planes is all about in landscape photography. Getting into a scene and deciding, what do I want to say here? Is it something about the depth of the ocean that matters? Then I've got to have more ocean than sky. Is it the vastness of the sky that matters, the beautiful clouds? If it is, then I've got to have more sky. So use your picture planes to tell your story correctly. Now we're going to talk about stitching. It is such an underrated process and it's so easy to do. Quite often when I talk about stitching to people, they think that it's some fancy Photoshop technique. It really is so simple. And with Lightroom, it's a one-click process. All you've got to do is take your pictures correctly. And there's two ways we can look at stitching. We're looking at HDR stacking and we're looking at panoramics. Firstly, we're going to talk about panoramics. Now, we use panoramics when our wide angle lens or whatever lens we're using can't fit in the entire landscape that we want to capture. We might have a fisheye lens, but remember what fisheyes do? Sometimes you get lens distortion and your edges start to curve. Now, this can happen with panoramics as well, but there's a way to fix it. And the process is quite simple. If we can't fit a landscape in one frame, we take a row of pictures across, overlapping by about 30%. And you might even do a row up above them and a row below them. You might want to capture everything. I would say there's no limit to how many rows you could have up and down, but there is. The processing power of your computer might manage. I've got a brand new MacBook, and this thing struggles with big panoramics. Sometimes it just says error and it can't do it if there's too many rows and I have to do 30 different frames. So it can be a slow process if you take too many. But if you just need a row of images to capture from left to right, one row, it's so simple to do. And you simply highlight all the images in Lightroom, right click, create panoramic. Some cameras might even do this inside the camera, and you're left with everything that you want inside the frame and a very beautiful landscape shot. So technically you don't really need a very wide angle if you don't want to buy one or can't afford one. You just need to know how to do panoramics. We're also going to look at HDR stacking. If you've ever wondered how some landscape photographers get these beautiful colors in the skies, rich colors in the foreground, and beautiful depth and color contrast in the middle areas, everything is perfectly exposed, and you go, my image is not coming out like that, the clouds are white, the grass is shit. It's because they're stacking. They're exposing the clouds, they're exposing the foreground, they're exposing the shadows correctly, they're exposing the highlights correctly. We've talked about this before. And it's as simple as keeping your camera still on a tripod. This is important because it has to line up everything. If you move around, it can't stack it. It can't stack trees from different angles on top of each other. It doesn't work. It has to be the same picture. So put your camera on a tripod and take as many different exposures as you like, exposing everything correctly, the clouds, the house, the trees. And then it's as simple as highlighting them in Lightroom and right-clicking, clicking Photo Merge, merges HDR, and there's various options. And then you can reserve all the details from the shadows to the highlights. All the colors are there for you to work with. So that's a little bit on stitching from panoramics to HDRs. This subject we can go on in such depth, and we really are going to deconstruct stitching and panoramics because there's so many different approaches, from very technical to very simple, that can help you with your landscape photography. But for now, that's what it is, and that's how simple it can be, and that's how much it can help you with your landscape images. We're going to talk about gear now for landscape photography. And now quite often, unless you're specifically a landscape photographer, it is quite hard to bring landscape gear with you. And the common mistake is people think the wider the better. If I don't have a 16-35 or a fixed 14mm or something ultra wide, I can't do landscape photography, which couldn't be further from the truth. Some of the best landscape shots that I've taken have been with a 70-200. Sometimes you want to compress distance, and you can only do that with a large focal length. So 70-200 is your best bet. Landscape doesn't mean wide by any means. It just means landscape, and you can capture landscape sometimes even better with a 70-200, a particular landscape, than you can with a wide angle lens. And remember, if we don't have a wide angle lens, we've just spoken about stitching and panoramics, which I often use because I often don't have space in my bag for a 16-35 because I've gone on a wildlife photography trip, but all of a sudden there's a beautiful landscape. I don't have a 16-35, that's fine. I stitch, I create a panoramic, and I get the whole scene in. So you don't actually need a lot of gear to create beautiful landscape shots. If you have a 24-70, you can create as beautiful landscape images as you would ever want, and do it quite simply through various techniques. If you're not wide enough, use a panoramic. If you want to compress distance, go to 70mm. It is such a versatile lens, and I absolutely love it for landscape photography. Obviously, also with landscape photography, you're often using light to your advantage, so your camera needs to be still. Not everyone can fit in a proper landscape photography tripod, big, heavy, cumbersome thing, unless you're going to Iceland and you're doing landscapes. Then I wouldn't bother with it. You're not taking big 400mm and big zoom lenses with you to do wildlife. You're just doing landscapes, so I would take a big, cumbersome tripod. What it does is its own weight helps hold it in the ground and hold it still. Quite often with travel tripods, if there's a lot of wind, it can shake the tripod, and if your shutter speed is open for 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 5 seconds, 1 second, which it often is for landscape photography, because you want to keep your ISO as low as possible because you can. Remember, with ISOs, as high as needed, as low as possible. So a travel tripod at the very least is important if you're keen on getting landscape photography right. It's also nice to have a large resolution camera, a large sensor. You can't really call it essential because you can take beautiful pictures with a 12 megapixel sensor. But if you're shooting wide and you want lots of details all the way from the foreground all the way to the background, and you want to blow that up big and you want to make a print out of it, a small resolution camera is going to struggle with those faraway details, and you might be able to see pixelation, whereas a large resolution camera can help you greatly with landscape photography. Lastly is graduation filters. These help us get super creative with our work. And remember, we spoke about struggling with different exposures. The clouds are coming out overexposed, the foreground's coming out too dark, and we're battling with the dynamic range in our image. So we use HDR stacking. We take a bunch of images and stack them together to get the correct exposure. But there's another way of doing this, and that's using neutral density filters or graduation filters. Filters you screw onto the lens quite simply darken certain parts of the frame. So if you want to create motion blur of waves flowing over rocks, which is a beautiful effect, and you want to slow your shutter speed all the way down to 10 seconds and get the effect as good as possible, but the sunset gets blown out and you lose all those colors, you put a graduation filter. It darkens the sky and you get to put your settings in. It allows you to create, it gives you a lot of scope, and usually they're quite cheap. So a graduation filter, if you want to step up your landscape photography game, is quite a nifty tool, and I suggest packing one. So that's landscape photography. I hope you enjoyed. That's the fundamentals, that's the basics. Like I said, we're going to go into detail into so many different approaches to landscape photography at a later stage. But for now, that's the fundamentals. I hope you enjoyed. Cheers.